Joe Finsternis, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about a movie called Europa Report. Now, this movie follows a group of scientists who are traveling to one of the moons of Jupiter, and this moon is covered in ice, but it also has some pockets of water on the surface, and there are some heat signatures which are detected by satellites, which is a big suggestion that this thing could be carrying life, and so that is what these astronauts are out to discover. Now, this movie is shot to look like a documentary, which doesn't just mean that it's a found footage movie where the whole thing's done in the first person. There are some scenes where it cuts to some interviews as well as some music that plays over the soundtrack. There's some on-screen text at times, which is how an actual documentary would, be edited to be like. And my only problem with this style is that early on in the movie there are some unnecessarily creepy moments. It is a horror film as well as a science fiction film, and there are a few moments where they do some pretty odd things to make the audience feel on edge. Like, there's one shot where you see some of the astronaut crew sitting around this room, and then suddenly it just abruptly cuts to a later time where they're not in the room, and so it looks like they've all disappeared. And then there's another moment where you see all of these different shots happening, in unison on screen, and from one of these, you hear the sound from each shot playing at the same time, and then suddenly from one of them you hear a man screaming, and then they all just cut off and go black before you can figure out which shot it was coming from. And of course the scream cuts off as well. And it doesn't go on to show you that something bad is happening. The astronaut crew is still fine for a few scenes after that. It's just kind of a cheap trick to make the audience feel creeped out. Now, I'm not saying that they could have convinced audiences that this was a documentary if they hadn't included those moments. I'm just saying that they could have made it feel that way at least. Unlike most, documentary or found footage type movies, this one does contain a few recognizable faces among the cast. Sharto Copley from District 9 plays one of the astronauts, for example. And there's also an astronaut, or not an astronaut, but a scientist on Earth played by the main guy from Balls of Fury, which may sound like a bit of a stretch, but this actor was also in a small independent film called Scenic Route, in which he showed that he had some acting capabilities, but I'm pretty much going off on a tangent at this point. Like I said, they wouldn't have been able to convince movie-savvy audiences that they were watching a documentary. Again, they could have made it feel a little more realistic. And going back to the casting, Sharto Copley really plays the only interesting character in the entire film. Like, the rest of the astronaut crew, their personalities just extend to, oh, I'm an astronaut and I'm out to discover things. But, Copley is the only character in the film who has a sense of humor and feels like he has his own backstory and everything. And he's the only one that you can sympathize with. For a while, he does make the movie worth watching, and then his character leaves the movie, and you're stuck with these boring assholes that you don't care about. And I wanted to care about them. There came a point where people started dying off in the movie, and I wanted to feel scared about what was happening, but I just couldn't bring myself to feel that way. And aside from the fact that the characters were really boring, the sort of death scenes became repetitive after a while. Essentially every time somebody left the spacecraft, it would mean certain death for them, and then the images on the camera would start messing up from the radiation. They would get a little blurry and a little shaky, and then, oops, someone's dead. And you don't quite know what killed them until the end of the movie. It gives you a big reveal at the end. You see what's been killing them, and it's okay. It looks like the type of thing which I could buy as something that exists somewhere out there in the universe, but it's not that scary, and you could really just chalk this up to the fact that I wasn't scared for the characters. I will say, despite my bashing of the film, it's not the worst. I was interested enough in the story to see how it ended, even though the ending was pretty underwhelming. And the movie is pretty to look at. There is one shot where you see all of these planets and it's rendered in this very cheap looking CGI effect, but aside from that, the effects in the movie are pretty decent. It has some really good visuals and it's very well shot, but the story, well, not the story, but the characters are just so boring, that as they're carrying the story, it just kind of falls flat. I guess that if you're a huge fan of Sharlto Copley, or if you're fascinated by space travel, then I don't know if it's showing on Netflix or not, but that's where I would recommend watching it. You might end up enjoying the movie a little more than I did, but I seriously doubt you're going to remember it. Anyway, that's all I've got to say about Europa Report. I hope you all have a good one.